Hello, class. Welcome to a Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me today. Did you know that the French and Indian War was a domino that had to fall in order for the colonists to eventually gain their independence, yet so few people are familiar with this conflict? That the English outnumbered the French by as much as 20-1 in the American colonies? That this conflict had been brewing for decades prior to the outbreak of fighting? And that while George Washington, believe it or not, is often blamed with starting the war, it was actually the French that made the first move toward conflict. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out, because today we will learn that and more in our first episode in our French and Indian War series. Episode 27, Foundation for War. Hello and welcome to class. To catch everyone up, I want to briefly provide context for our lesson today. So last week, Zach, Bill, and I had a discussion on the Enlightenment ideas during the 18th century and their effects on the English colonists, and most notably on the founding fathers of the United States of America. Over the past few episodes, we've covered a variety of topics, including the political unrest in England and its effects on the colonies, ideas of freedom of press, religious upheaval, and Enlightenment thought in the colonies. We spent time on these topics the last few episodes to establish a political, social, and religious culture in the colonies during this time that will be important to understand when considering the motivations and perspectives of the colonists in the pre-revolutionary period. As I mentioned in the introduction, today's episode will be the first in a series of many covering the conflict commonly referred to in the United States of America as the French and Indian War. What we will see in our chronological narrative of United States history is that following this war, the colonists will seemingly immediately turn their attention from the French and France's native allies towards a more familiar foe, the English king and Parliament. Knowing that, it will be helpful for you to have learned about and understand the events such as the Glorious Revolution, the Great Awakening, and the Enlightenment, so you can have proper perspective on colonial thought and action. That being said, let's get started with the topic for today, laying the groundwork for the French and Indian War. Whenever I taught about the French and Indian War in history class, I was consistently met with ignorance. Not willful ignorance, mind you, but students just didn't know a lot about this war and honestly didn't realize the impact that this war has had on American history. And it isn't just the students I taught. Most adults are only vaguely familiar with this conflict, if they're familiar with it at all, and won't know most of the details we're going to cover in this episode, which is what makes this episode so exciting for me and also hopefully for you. The name French and Indian War is primarily used here in the United States of America, and it refers to the two main enemies of the colonists, the French and the Indians who allied with them. The confusing aspect of this name, and there are a couple things that make it pretty confusing, is that this conflict in the colonies, which lasts from, for all intents and purposes, 1754 to 1760, will tie in with the conflict in Europe, which is often named the 7 Years' War. In Canada, they refer to the French and Indian War as the War of Conquest, which makes sense because from their perspective, the English conquered Canada. Now, usually wars that the English were involved in were named after the ruling monarch of the time, like King George's War, Queen Anne's War, etc. But, because the English just kept getting themselves involved in wars, they ran out of names. They already had a King George's War, so they had to come up with something different. I want to make very clear before we begin this episode that although the English colonists and later Americans have named this conflict the French and Indian War, Native Americans fought on both sides and played a critical role in eventually helping to secure an English victory. I mentioned that the French and Indian War overlapped with the 7 Years' War in Europe. While the conflict began in the colonies in 1754, it spilled over into Europe 2 years later in 1756, and lasted about 3 years longer, until the Treaty of Paris in 1763, hence the name 7 Years' War. People often look at the first year of fighting in the colonies in 1754 and know that the treaty to end the war wasn't until 1763, and then can't figure out for the life of them why it's called the 7 Years' War, because that's a 9-year period. Well, that's because the 7 Years' War is the European name for the war, and that didn't begin until 1756. 1756, 1763, in Europe, 7 Years' War. So that's why. Hopefully that clears it up a little bit. The French-Indian War was referred to as the First World War by Winston Churchill, and in retrospect, he seems to be correct in his assessment. This war not only had significant short and long-term impacts on the English and the French, but also Native Americans and, obviously, English colonists. Now, these impacts are things that we will discuss in much more detail in subsequent episodes. But today we're going to lay the groundwork for this war, put it all into context, and understand why the war began and what the situation was at the outbreak of war. At the time of the beginning of this war, the French have somewhere between 55,000 and 75,000 colonists, depending on which historian you ask, who had been traveling through the Great Lakes region. They traveled along the Mississippi River Valley and south into Louisiana, often, as we've talked about, creating friendly trading alliances with the natives in this region, primarily trading fur. On the flip side, the British had somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million colonists, potentially outnumbering the French by as much as 20-1 in the American colonies. You can understand why the English, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about the conflict, but the English dragged their feet a bit on getting involved in this conflict because they just assumed that outnumbering the French by this much, they would be able to easily overwhelm the French just by sheer numbers. But as we'll find out, at the beginning of the war, that wasn't quite the case. So this conflict, if you don't already know, is going to be focused around the region known as the Ohio River Valley. The Ohio River Valley constitutes much of western Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, and parts of Indiana and Illinois, basically the region surrounding the Ohio River. Now, the Ohio River Valley is really important, and the reason it's so important in the 1750s is because the French controlled much of what is present-day southern Canada, areas along the Great Lakes region, areas along the Mississippi River, so the Mississippi River Valley, and like I mentioned, areas in Louisiana. The English, as we know, settled along the East Coast and, depending on which colony you look at, had expanded as far west as the Appalachian Mountains in most cases. If the French are able to take the Ohio River Valley and connect this area with the Mississippi River Valley, Louisiana, and the Great Lakes region, they are able to create a seemingly impenetrable wall for the English. They're able to thwart English westward expansion if they can take this region. On the other hand, conversely, if the English can take the Ohio River Valley, they have, for all intents and purposes, cut the French claim, New France, in two, splitting Louisiana and the areas around the Great Lakes in southern Canada, and they're going to drive a wedge in between New France, which will make it significantly more difficult for the French to maintain control of the region. So this was a really important territory at this time. Unofficially, in the Ohio River Valley, the Iroquois controlled the region, and tribes such as the Delaware, Shawnee, and Mingos lived in the region, technically operating under the authority of the Iroquois League. Most of the native tribes in the western portion of this region, so like present-day Illinois, Indiana, allied themselves with the French. They supported the French, while the Iroquois and all the native tribes under the Iroquois League, or control of the Iroquois League, had a history of diplomatic relations with the English. One thing that's important to understand is that the native alliances and relationships in this region at this time were really complicated. We have to remember that a lot of times in history we view Native Americans as one unified group of people, but they weren't. The natives were often competing with each other as much as they were competing with the Europeans. The diseases that had ravaged natives along the East Coast also spread further inland, creating very vulnerable native tribes and power vacuums in various areas. As I mentioned, the Iroquois had gained control of this region through warfare, but this didn't mean that all tribes in the region would suddenly coalesce and live amongst each other peacefully. In the decades leading up to war, the French had tried to mediate these various conflicts between the warring native tribes, knowing that native warfare would only hurt their trade and their bottom line. Through this mediation, the French had taken on a paternal role with these native tribes, earning valuable alliances in the process, which will then, of course, help them in this conflict. The alliance system that seemed to be naturally falling into place was one of the native tribes in the middle ground allying themselves with the French, and then warring against the Iroquois Confederacy, who were supported by the English. As I mentioned in a previous episode, the Grand Settlement of 1701 saw the Iroquois nation create a tenuous alliance with the French, the English, and other native tribes in this region, the Ohio River Valley. The Iroquois were frustrated with the English after they deemed the English to be crappy allies and said that they were going to remain neutral. Because of this neutrality, the French allowed the Iroquois to travel and trade throughout the Ohio River Valley as far northwest as Detroit, Michigan. What the French didn't realize is that during negotiations with the English, the Iroquois had laid claim to this land and then subsequently handed it over to the English in a later diplomatic settlement. But while the Iroquois claimed neutrality in the Grand Settlement of 1701, they maintained a relationship with the English, especially in New York, based off of the Covenant chain, which was established in the late 1600s. So unbeknownst to the French, the Ohio River Valley, which they believed to be safely under their control, was seen by the English as their newest acquisition to the burgeoning English Empire, thanks to their relationship with the Iroquois. So you can probably see where this is headed, towards conflict. And we'll return to this budding conflict right after this. Hello everyone, thanks so much for checking out the podcast today. I have a short announcement. Bill, Zach, and I have the opportunity to include a sponsor in our episodes, and while we didn't plan on this happening, we also don't want to pass up the opportunity. But what's really important to us is that we have a huge amount of respect not only for you, the listener, but the quality of our content and our programming, and we're very sensitive to including any type of endorsement or sponsorship into our episodes. So I want to let you know that we're considering doing this and likely will move forward with it. But I, Bill, Zach, or anyone else who joins me in my podcast will never endorse any product we don't use and fully believe in. And you have our word with that. If you have any thoughts or comments, please always feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, Facebook, or email chris@ateachershistory.com. Thanks for your understanding, and let's get back to the French and Indian War. Further complicating matters was the nuanced relationship between the natives in the region. Remember the walking purchase of 1737? It was an event that Zach and I covered in detail in episode 14. If you don't recall, this is where Thomas Penn bamboozled the natives out of 700,000 acres of land in eastern Pennsylvania and forced these eastern Pennsylvanian natives further west into the Ohio River Valley. Not only does bringing up this event allow me to use the word bamboozled, which is so underrated, but also underscores the reality that thousands of natives were forced west into this region as refugees. Additionally, the main reason why the English were able to pull off this fraud? Because the Iroquois supported English claims to the land. So these natives who were forced to move west, such as the Shawnee and the Delaware tribes, were pretty pissed at the Iroquois and didn't see much point to remaining voluntarily under their control, seeing as how the Iroquois helped the English screw them over and displace them and their families. Because of this, they moved further west into the forks of the Ohio, where present-day Pittsburgh is located today. A third tribe, the Mingos, also lived in this territory and also wanted to get away from Iroquois control, moving further west, deeper into the Ohio River Valley. In the decade preceding war, thousands of natives lived in this region, many of them not particularly friendly with the Iroquois and living as refugees, trying to navigate the complicated political and social atmosphere of this region, which they are new to and unfamiliar with. The Iroquois, not understanding just how desperately these natives wanted to free themselves from Iroquois control, were hopeful that the native tribes in this region would help control the Europeans and maintain Iroquois supremacy in the Ohio River Valley. Since the War of Austrian Succession, when the English temporarily took over Louisburg, English traders had become more ambitious, traveling throughout the Ohio River Valley, trying to develop trade networks within the region, but not seeing much success. The French saw the initial effort by the English to establish some type of trading presence in the region and decided to try to prevent this English presence from being established and from growing. As an aside, I'll be mentioning many French names in future episodes, and likely butchering most, if not all of them. I've never had any formal education in the French language, and have always been pretty terrible at it. If I pronounce a name poorly, and you're thinking, wow, Chris really butchered that one, yes, I probably did, and I apologize in advance. Anyways, in 1747, the French tasked Pierre-Joseph Saint-Laurent with leading a military expedition through New France to ensure that their native allies in this region were not being tempted by the English traders and, were remaining loyal to the French. Saint-Laurent traveled about 3,000 miles throughout 1749 and 1750, officially, finally, laying claim to the region and telling any British men he encountered to get out. He made sure to mark his travels throughout this region and announced to everyone that this land was claimed by the French. In order to do this, he buried lead plates in the ground. Yeah, I know, who would have ever thought that this wouldn't be an effective method of land claim? In addition to this asinine idea, he was also unsuccessful in convincing the natives to stop trading with the English, seeing as how most natives, just ignored him. Saint-Laurent wrote that, quote, "All I can say is that the natives of these localities are very badly disposed towards the French and are entirely devoted to the English. I don't know in what way they could be brought back." The English, recognizing that the French were making moves in the Ohio River Valley, decided that they also were going to lay claim to this land. Because why not? In 1749, London gave the Ohio Company of Virginia land in the Ohio River Valley and told them to settle families in this region, as many as possible and as quickly as possible. In 1752, in Logstown, Pennsylvania, the English signed a treaty with Tenagrisson, a Mingo chief who was acting on behalf of the Iroquois, creatively naming this treaty the Treaty of Logstown. From here on out, I'll refer to Tenagrisson the same way the English and subsequent historians have often referred to him, as the Half-King. Legend has it that the Half-King hated the French because he believed the French had killed and then eaten his father, and if that's true, then that is a pretty damn good reason to hate them. The Half-King, like I mentioned, was a Mingo leader at the time, and according to him, was acting on behalf of the Iroquois League. But the Half-King made it very clear that any decision he made was going to need approval by the Iroquois Council, so he didn't have total authority. One could even say he had about half of the needed authority, hence the nickname Half-King. Now, look, there are a bunch of Half-Kings throughout European and Native relations, but in our survey of American history, this is the only one we'll mention. So when I say Half-King, I'm referring to Tenagrisson of the Mingo tribe. More recent scholarship on the Half-King have raised doubts about any formal power he may have had, and some historians posited that he was just in fact a village leader of a small group of Mingo refugees who was trying to make a power play in the region, pushing all of his chips in the middle, betting hard on the English to prevail and for him to personally reap the rewards through his alliance. But look, no matter the true status of the half-king, for our purposes, it's important to understand that while he seemed to hold some type of formal power in the region, his actual authority is pretty questionable. So the Treaty of Logstown, which allowed the English to build a trading post in present-day Pittsburgh, an area that the French had already officially claimed by burying their lead plates in the ground, will obviously become an issue. Once the French see the growing relationship between the English and the natives in the region, they decide once and for all, like really this time, to take action. In 1753, Paul Morand de la Mogue was given command of 2,000 men and tasked with following Céloron's path, except he wasn't dumb enough to bury lead plates in the ground and instead, built garrisoned forts throughout the region. Much more effective. The Iroquois, seeing French advance into this region, pleaded with the New York representatives that they had had such a great relationship with over the years to respond to this very real threat by the French, but were unable to convince them to do so. The Iroquois, despondent over the lack of action by the English, claimed that as far as they were concerned, the English representatives had broken the covenant chain and seriously threatened the alliance between English and Iroquois, an alliance that will be tenuous at best in the subsequent years. And this is where we'll leave off this week, with the French sending an expedition of 2,000 men into the Ohio River Valley and proactively and preemptively building garrison forts in the region, effectively laying claim to the area. As you pack up your things, I want you to take a second and just consider the numerous people, events, conflicts, and relationships that led to the French-Indian War. I want this episode, which covers a lot of information that's never mentioned in a history book, to be an example to you of just how much more complicated and nuanced most people and events throughout history are than you may think. The changing alliances, social and economic strain, and lack of effective communication led the French and the English on a collision course for war. Next episode, we will get into much greater detail about the role that the half-king and George Washington, yes, that George Washington, played in taking this conflict to another level. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. So, like I mentioned, next week we will dive into the escalation of this conflict, where George Washington makes some pretty questionable decisions and gets bamboozled by both the half-king and the French. Fate told you I like the word bamboozle. See you next week.